He was already on the runway when I told him not to be, and the plane was 4 minutes out. And I was the only person in that tower who understood exactly how bad that combination was. My name is Oryn Tate. I'm 32 years old. I work the overnight shift in the air traffic control tower at Austin Straubel International Airport in Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is not the kind of airport that makes national news, which is exactly the kind of airport where the unglamorous essential work of keeping aircraft and humans alive happens every single night without anyone noticing. I talk to pilots, I sequence arrivals and departures. I manage the airspace over northeastern Wisconsin with the specific, low-drama professionalism that this job requires, which is to say, I keep my voice flat, I keep my hands steady, and I do not, under any circumstances, allow anything that is happening outside my headset to become more important than what is happening inside it. At 2:31 a.m. on a Wednesday in March, a regional turboprop out of Minneapolis declared emergency. Hydraulic failure. Partial gear deployment. The crew had partial brakes and a prayer, and they were descending into Green Bay in 30-knot crosswinds with an ice-slick runway and 6 passengers who did not know yet how bad their night was about to get. I had handled emergency landings before, 3 in 4 years. This was my 4th. What I had not handled before was the runway inspection crew's report, which came in at 2:33 a.m. A section of runway 24 left, approximately 400 feet from the threshold, had experienced a subsurface void collapse. A 3-foot depression, sudden, directly in the centerline. The runway was compromised. The aircraft was 6 minutes out. I had exactly the wrong amount of time to solve an impossible problem. And that is when a voice came through the ground crew frequency, calm, direct, carrying 0 wasted words, and said, "Tower, this is Callahan, ARFF Unit 1. I'm at the collapse site. Talk to me. Stay with me, because the next 4 minutes are why I still think about this night 2 years later." ARFF stands for Aircraft Rescue and Firefighting. Callahan was the crew chief of Green Bay's Airport Emergency Response Unit, the people who sit at the end of the runway in specialized vehicles on every single flight, every single day, waiting for the thing that almost never happens. His unit had been on a routine overnight equipment check when the collapse occurred. He was already on scene before I'd finished processing the runway report. "Callahan, I have a partial gear emergency inbound," I said. 6 minutes. Runway 24 left is my primary. The collapse is at 400 feet past threshold. That's mid-rollout. If the gear catches that depression at rollout speed... "I know what happens," he said, not cutting me off. "Just already there, already ahead of me in the calculation. Can you divert to 24 right?" Crosswind on 24 right is 32 knots. Partial brakes, partial gear. That crosswind puts them off the pavement. "So we fixed the runway," he said. I looked at my screen. I looked at the aircraft's transponder, descending through 4,000 feet. I looked at the clock. "You have 5 minutes 40 seconds, I said. "What do you need?" he said. "I need that depression filled or marked, so the crew can steer around it," I said. "It's centerline. They're going to be fighting the aircraft. They won't have margin to track a deviation unless it's marked with something they can see at rollout speed in the dark." A pause. 2 seconds. "I have emergency foam and runway marker stakes in Unit 1. The foam won't fill it structurally, but it'll give the gear something to compress across instead of dropping into. The stakes give your crew a visual corridor." "Do it," I said. "You have 5:20. "Copy," he said. And then, already moving, I could hear the unit's engine in the background. "Stay on this frequency." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I want to tell you what the next 5 minutes felt like from inside a tower. But first, if you've never heard one of these stories before, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. I put a new one out every single day. Every day, a different city, a different crisis, a different 2 people finding each other in the middle of it. You don't want to miss tomorrow's. Now, the next 5 minutes. I was managing 3 things simultaneously. The inbound aircraft, whose crew I was talking through their approach on 121.5. The ground crew coordination on the ARFF frequency, where Callahan's voice was the only thing keeping me from the specific panic that comes from watching a problem you cannot physically reach, and the Airport Operations Center, which wanted updates I didn't have time to give. Callahan worked fast. I know this because I could track his unit's position on the ground radar, and because every 90 seconds he gave me a status update in exactly the format I needed, what was done, what was left, how much time he needed. At 4 minutes, foam deployed, depression is packed. Staking the corridor now. At 5 minutes, visual corridor is set. 16 stakes, alternating red and white, 15 feet either side of centerline. Your crew will see it. At 5 minutes 20 seconds, I'm clear of the runway. Unit 1 is in position at the threshold. I clicked over to the aircraft frequency. Sierra Mike 441, Green Bay Tower. Runway 24 left is available. Be advised, you will see emergency marker stakes on the centerline at approximately 400 feet past threshold. Maintain centerline. The markers define a clear corridor. ARFF is in position. You are cleared to land. The captain's voice came back steady. Pilots. Sierra Mike 441, cleared to land. 24 left. We have the runway. I watched the transponder descend through 300 feet, 200, the localizer, the glide path. The moment the wheels touched, and they touched, all of them, including the partial gear, because the crew was good and the runway was marked and the foam had done what Callahan said it would do, I felt something leave my body that I had not realized I was holding. The aircraft rolled out, slow, controlled, past the 400-foot mark, through the staked corridor, decelerating cleanly. It stopped 40 feet from the end of the pavement. 6 passengers, 2 crew. Everyone walked off that aircraft. I sat in my chair in the tower for approximately 3 seconds, which is all I allowed myself, and then I filed the emergency notification and updated the runway status and called the operations center and did all of the things that come after the crisis, which are many and which exist specifically to prevent you from sitting in the aftermath and feeling it. At 3:14 a.m., the ARFF frequency clicked. Tower, Callahan said. Good sequencing tonight. Good runway work, I said. The foam was the right call. The corridor stakes were your idea. The foam was yours, I said. The corridor needed both. A pause. Operational pauses sound different from other pauses. This one was different. Are you on until 6? He said. Until 6, I said. I'll be on the ramp, he said. If you want to debrief in person. Debrief in person. Standard procedure after an emergency incident, completely normal, entirely professional. I'll come down at 6, I said. I'll be there, he said. Here's what I didn't know yet, and this is the part that changes everything about the first 5 minutes of this story. Lachlan Callahan had been the ARFF crew chief at Austin Straubel for 3 years. In those 3 years, he had been on the ground frequency for every single emergency that had come through Green Bay's airspace. 4 total, including tonight. He had heard my voice on all 4. I had heard his voice on 2. But I had thought about those 2 a disproportionate number of times for a disproportionate number of months. In the specific private way, you think about a voice that has given you exactly what you needed at the moment you needed it, which is a kind of intimacy that doesn't have a standard name, but that anyone who has worked emergency operations will recognize immediately. I had not looked him up. I had been careful about that. I had a policy, self-imposed, about not looking up the faces that went with voices I'd cataloged in the back of my mind as significant. The policy existed because the last time I'd broken it, the face had not matched the voice, and the disappointment had been, in a way I couldn't entirely explain, larger than seemed reasonable. I broke the policy at 3:47 a.m. with 2 hours left in my shift and nothing to do but manage routine traffic and think about the word debrief. The airport directory had a photo. Standard ID style, the kind that nobody looks good in. He looked good in it. Dark hair, jaw like a decision that had already been made, and eyes that, even in a fluorescent-lit ID photo, carried the same quality as his voice. Direct, present, not performing anything. I looked at the photo for longer than I should have. Then I closed the directory and went back to my frequency and spent the next 2 hours being a professional at 3 a.m. I came down from the tower. Green Bay in March at 6 in the morning is a specific kind of cold. Not Alaska cold, not dramatic. Just the steady Midwestern cold that has been there so long it feels like a permanent condition of the air. The ramp was gray and quiet. The overnight flights done, the morning banks not yet started. The ARFF unit was parked at the threshold of runway 24 left, exactly where it was supposed to be. He was leaning against the front of the vehicle, not looking at his phone, not doing anything. Just there in the early morning, watching the runway with the patient attention of someone who has spent years watching runways and has not yet gotten tired of what they tell you. He saw me when I was still 20 feet away. Turned. Not a snap, a turn, deliberate. And looked at me the way I had expected him to look based on his voice and had been trying not to anticipate based on his photo. He was taller than the photo suggested. The flight suit was traded for an ARFF jacket now, and there was foam residue on his left sleeve that he hadn't noticed or hadn't cared about. His eyes, in the gray March morning, were the specific color of Lake Michigan in November, not pretty lake color, honest lake color, the kind that means something about depth. "Tate," he said. "Callahan," I said. We looked at each other. The ramp was empty. The runway stretched behind him, the state corridor still visible at 400 feet, red and white alternating, exactly as he'd placed them in the dark, with 4 minutes on the clock. "The foam held," I said. "It'll hold until maintenance gets out here," he said. "The void needs proper repair." "I filed the report at 3:15, I said. "Maintenance crew is scheduled for 8. He nodded, looked at me. "You filed it while you were still managing traffic." "The filing window was open," I said. "Most controllers wait until end of shift." "The paperwork doesn't get better if I wait," I said. Something moved through his expression. That slow thing. That weather deciding its direction thing. "No," he said. "It doesn't." He looked at the runway again, then back at me. "How many emergencies is this for you?" "4th, I said. "You?" "7th deployment," he said. "First time I've had to foam a void with 5 minutes of notice." Was it enough time? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It was exactly enough time," he said. "Not more." "That's the best kind of margin," I said. "That's the only kind we get," he said. The cold was serious between us. The ramp wind coming off the runway, unimpeded, the kind of cold that makes you aware of where warmth is and where it isn't. He was close enough that I was aware of it, the warmth coming off him at the edge of the ramp wind. "Oryn," he said, my first name. From the directory listing he had absolutely also looked at. "You read the directory," I said. "Staff photo and everything," he said. Without apology, with the corner of his mouth moving, "The photo is terrible," I said. "The photo is fine," he said, quietly, like it was a fact he'd already verified to his own satisfaction. My chest did something I hadn't scheduled. "Lachlan," I said, his first name. Something shifted in his face, quick, then slower, the way light changes when a cloud moves. "Yeah," he said. "I want to get breakfast," I said. "Not as a debrief." He looked at me for a long moment, the runway behind him, the state corridor, the early Green Bay morning doing its flat, honest, Midwestern thing. "There's a place on Lombardi Avenue," he said. "Opens at 6:30. I've been meaning to go since they opened in November, and I haven't found the right reason." "Is this a good enough reason?" I said. He pushed off the vehicle, stood to his full height, looked at me with those Lake Michigan eyes in the gray March light and said, simply, "It's the right one. I need to stop here and tell you something, because this is the moment I keep coming back to, and it happened before we ever got to breakfast." We were walking toward the parking structure when he stopped. Just stopped, in the middle of the ramp, and turned to face me. Full turn, deliberate. "Can I say something?" he said. "Yes," I said. "I've been on 7 emergency deployments in 3 years," he said. 7 times I've been the person on the ground while someone in the tower is managing the aircraft. And every single time, the thing that determines whether it goes right is whether the controller and the ground crew are actually talking to each other, not just transmitting. Actually talking. He paused. Tonight was the first time I felt like we were actually talking. I stood in the cold ramp air and thought about the 5 minutes, the phone call, the corridor stakes, the way he'd given me status updates in exactly the format I needed without being told the format. You gave me updates every 90 seconds, I said, without being asked. You needed 90-second intervals, he said, based on the approach timing. You calculated the approach timing from the ground, I said. I had your inbound sequence on my unit display, he said. I know how to read a descent profile. Most ARFF crews don't read descent profiles. I like to know what the tower is seeing, he said. It makes the coordination. He stopped, looked for the word. Cleaner. Cleaner, I said. Yes. We looked at each other in the early morning. The airport was waking up around us. Ground crews starting their pre-dawn checks. The first morning departure being towed to the gate. The ordinary machinery of a working airport, resuming after a night that had briefly been something else. His hand was at his side. Open. Not reaching? Just present, the way I'd come to understand his presence. Deliberate without being demanding. Available without being insistent. I reached out and my fingers found his. Not a hold. Not yet. Just contact. The specific warmth of another person's hand in cold air, which is one of the most honest things there is. He looked down at our hands, then up at my face, the Lake Michigan eyes, fully present, fully there. His fingers closed around mine, slowly. Completely. Lombardi Avenue, he said. Lombardi Avenue, I said. We walked off the ramp together into the Green Bay morning, and the runway behind us was marked and safe, and the void was filed, and the aircraft was at the gate, and 6 people were making phone calls to their families, and none of them would ever know our names, which was exactly how it was supposed to be. That's the job. This, his hand in mine, the cold air, the flat, honest Wisconsin morning, this was something the job had nothing to do with. The place on Lombardi Avenue was called Daybreak. Warm inside, the way diners are warm when they've been open since before you arrived and have absorbed years of mornings into the walls. We took a booth. Coffee came immediately. He wrapped both hands around the mug, ARFF jacket still on, foam residue still on the left sleeve, and looked at me across the table like he'd been waiting for the right surface to look at me properly and had finally found one. Tell me something your personnel file doesn't have, he said. My personnel file is very boring, I said. I noticed, he said. I grew up in Appleton, I said. 40 minutes south of here. My mother was a dispatch supervisor for the county. She talked about frequency management at dinner like other families talked about sports. I thought it was normal. Turns out it's not normal. Turns out it's just me. He smiled. Full, slow. The first full smile I'd seen from him. It changed his face completely. Not into something different, into something more of itself, like a frequency that has found its correct tuning. My father worked the tarmac at Mitchell Airport in Milwaukee for 22 years, he said. He said, the runway is honest. It doesn't care who you are or what you think you know. You either prepared or you didn't, and the runway will tell you which. The runway is honest, I said. And the tower, he said, looking at me, when it's running right. I looked at him across the coffee and the table and the early morning. Outside, Lombardi Avenue was starting its day. Green Bay waking up, the cold and ordinary and specific morning of a city that works hard and doesn't perform about it. Inside, this booth, this coffee, this man who had foamed a runway void with 4 minutes on the clock and given me status updates in exactly the right format and looked me up in the staff directory and waited on the ramp at 6 in the morning for no operational reason. I reached across the table. He met me halfway, his hand sliding forward across the table surface until our fingers overlapped, palm to palm, warm and unhurried, the grip of 2 people who have already been through the hard part together and are now simply letting the rest of it be easy. You okay? He said. I keep being, I said. The smile again, deeper this time, the kind that lives in the eyes longer than the mouth. Me too, he said. Outside, a morning flight lifted off runway 24 right, climbing into the gray Wisconsin sky. Clean, on course, exactly where it was supposed to be, same as us. If this story stayed with you, there's a new one tomorrow. Same time. Different city, different crisis, different two people finding each other in the middle of it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Every single day.